And we are back. Shalom, Caroline. How are you?
Great. How you doing, Avi?
Healthy, home and healthy, and homeschooling the kids like you, right?
Yeah, that's the thing of it. We never knew that we were going to be teachers, did we?
That's right. That's right. All right. Well, it's been a while, and the world keeps on turning at this crazy, crazy pace. Now we want to talk about Sudan, the latest Arab, or I don't know how to describe, or the Sudan actually. What country?
They're Arabs. They're African Arabs. They're Arabs.
A Muslim country or just an Arab country with
Well, it's all Muslim except for South Sudan, which is animist and Christian, which is why they separated away because they, suffered through decades of repression and misery. So then there was a big war and blah blah blah.
Got it. All right. If you'll just take the
Darfuris also were not. The Darfuris also were not are not Muslims. So, but it's a majority Muslim country, and until recently, it was a huge state sponsor of terrorism. So right. This is a big switch for the better.
The normalization, right? The newest Arab Muslim country normalizing relations thanks to this Abraham Accords. All right. What do you have to say? Good news, bad news? How do we look at it, Carolyn?
So first of all, it's great news. It's great news for the world that Sudan has a new government that isn't a supporter of terrorism. And let's just remember, until 1995, Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda were headquartered in Khartoum. Sudan was long a very, very prolific sponsor of terrorism. They had close relationship with the PLO for decades and with Hamas. They were really, really a bad actor, and they've had a series of political upheavals that led to the formation of a transitional sort of quasi-military civilian government. Earlier this week, I think it was on Monday, President Trump announced that the United States was removing Sudan from the state sponsors of terrorism list, which is a huge deal, which is something that the new government of Sudan desperately wanted so that they could generate trade and U.S. economic sanctions on them and on their oil exports. And in exchange, they agreed to pay restitution to U.S. victims of the Al Qaeda bombings of the U.S. embassies in Tanzania and in Kenya that occurred 24 years ago in 1998. So this was a big move forward, and everybody saw it as a necessary precondition to the normalization of ties between Israel and Sudan. And lo and behold, today it was announced that an Israeli delegation just is either in Khartoum now or just left Khartoum, and they were moving towards normalization or an announcement of the normalization of Israeli Sudanese relations. So this is a huge deal for not only for Israel, but I would say for the fight against terrorism, for the fight against Islamic Jihad in general, and really for the benefit of Africa and for the Arab world. It's a very big move.
No, it's interesting because I'm hearing two different perspectives on now the three Arab Muslim countries that are normalizing relations with Israel. On the one hand, they're doing this to strengthen relations with Israel during a Trump presidency to hopefully ensure that Trump remains president. And I've heard another perspective saying, no, they're doing it in order to strengthen themselves before a potential Biden presidency, where it will be a more dangerous area with a Biden presidency removing the sanctions against Iran and emboldening Iran once again. What's your take on all that?
I think that the latter is a more persuasive position because, frankly, maybe people disillusion themselves into thinking that foreign affairs is a decisive issue in American elections, but I don't think that it is. I don't think it has been. There's some argument claiming that it was a decisive issue in the 1952 elections because Eisenhower promised to remove U.S. forces from Korea or to end the war there. But aside from that, there have been really no clear-cut cases where U.S. presidential elections were decided on the basis of foreign policy. Certainly, nothing as esoteric and as removed from the American experience as peace in the Middle East. Even though this is a this is a banner issue for the left mainly, but it isn't a voting issue for most Americans. So I don't think that it has anything to do with that. I think that it does have much more to do with countries. First of all, obviously hoping that on the margins it will help Trump. And since this is going to be an election that is decided very much at the margins in some very key swing states where, Trump won by very small margins in 2016. So, there's that. But I think that mainly it is really that states have to figure out a way to protect their interests in the event that Biden does get elected, because we will see a very dramatic shift in U.S. Middle East policy in the event that President Trump leaves office in January and is replaced by Biden, who was one of the architects of Obama's very radical anti-American, and pro-pan-Islamist administration. And he has promised to revert to U.S. foreign policy from the America First policy that embraces U.S. allies who share American interests and American goals in the international arena, with one that is supportive of pan-Islamist movements and regimes like Hamas, like Iran, at the expense of U.S. allies and first and foremost Israel and the Sunni states that are making peace with us today. So I think, they view Israel as a means to withstand or offset U.S. pressure in a possible Biden administration, both because of the cooperation that we give them directly and also because it will maintain support for them among Republicans at a minimum in the United States.
Interesting. Now, as a segue to the whole growing censorship of big tech companies, I just wanted to focus on it. It's not censorship outright, but it is a bias of mainstream media, editorial lines. Here we're talking about the third Arab Muslim country in just a number of months normalizing relations with Israel. Huge, historic events, really seismic events in modern history. And yet mainstream news stations, both in America and in Israel, even in Israel, are playing them down. Very little celebration, just treating them like passing headlines if they're talking about them at all. Are you surprised about that?
Not surprised. I'm disgusted. Look, I mean, because what it really does is it exposes the whole peace mania that we've been subjected to for the past 25 years is a complete lie. I mean, look, these people don't care about peace. If they cared about peace, whether it's the Israeli left or the American left, or the Democrats or the Israeli, leftist parties, then they would be so happy today. They would be dancing in the streets today that we're seeing a new era of Israel-Arab relations unfold right before our eyes. And the very opposite is happening. I posted on my Twitter page earlier this week a recording of Israeli television news anchor woman Yonit Levy discussing the signing of the normalization accord that Israeli representatives signed in Manama, Bahrain earlier this week. Channel 12, which is where she anchors the primetime news, they have a monopoly share of the primetime news rating. So this is the highest rating news shows. It's also just pure leftist propaganda on many, many levels. And so here she is, Miss TV Israel, sort of like the would-be Walter Cronkite of Israeli news, and she's sitting there telling the viewers that Israel has signed this historic pact with Manama, and her tone of voice couldn't be more mournful. And for somebody who didn't understand Hebrew, and also her facial expressions were so sad and depressed. Somebody who didn't understand Hebrew would think that she was talking about a terrorist attack. And yet there she was discussing this historic peace accord. And this has really been the tenor of a lot of the news coverage also. I mean, you'll see last night, and just for fun, or 2 nights ago, I was timing how long various segments were lasting on the news. So 2 days ago, a delegation from the United Arab Emirates came and they met Prime Minister Netanyahu and Finance Minister Israel Katz, and they signed all of these economic cooperation agreements. They signed a visa waiver agreement, which in and of itself is sort of stunning because Israelis have to get visas to enter the United States. not to mention Egypt and Jordan, and yet now they don't have to get visas. They don't have to fly for visas to go to Abu Dhabi. So these are sort of stunning developments that nobody would have ever imagined, and they're happening in real time. And so the news report of this was given 4 minutes of coverage. But the story afterwards, which was about an uptake in violence against women, which is, of course, an important story, was 12 minutes long. The coronavirus coverage before that was 20 minutes long. So, it was just sort of sandwiched between these two stories. And this is probably the most earth-shattering geostrategic development in Israeli history. The Arab boycott is over. Israel is integrating its economy into the region for the first time ever. We were forced, compelled by the Arab boycott and by the Arab war against us to develop all of our markets in Europe at the outset of the state and for the first several decades of Israeli history. And it was sort of bizarre that we would do that, of course, because Israel was established 3 years after Germany and many nations in Europe were actively involved in genocide of Jewry. And yet here we were, completely dependent on Germany, for instance, economically through most of the 1950s. And it was because we weren't able to integrate into our region. Then, of course, thankfully, we've expanded our markets very much to Asia. We've become a much more Asian economy over the past decade. But here, we're going to be able to start integrating our economy into our region, which is extraordinary. It's extraordinary on just about every level. It will impact almost every aspect of the Israeli market. And you get four minutes of news coverage in an hour-and-a-half long news broadcast, between 20 minutes on coronavirus and another 10, 20 minutes on domestic violence. So this is sort of the situation that we have on broadcast news. And of course, in the United States, it's very much the same way. I was watching this documentary on Israeli communities in Sudan and Samaria, and part of it was a retrospective on the first Palestinian uprising that began at the end of 1987. And it really struck me how central the Palestinian assault on Israel's very right to exist has been to the Western narrative about the Middle East for decades, going back since the 1970s and the OPEC oil embargo on the United States following the 73 war. You can imagine, here is this totally unimportant conflict from a geostrategic position, but it just received this sort of supernatural sense of importance for everybody who claimed to know anything about the Middle East. It never made the slightest bit of sense. Somebody falling, as they, people used to say, to the ground from Mars, looking at the situation, say, "Are you kidding me?" Wars are breaking out all over the Arab world, all over the Islamic world, and you're saying that the most important thing is this one group of people, the Palestinians, who have one of the highest qualities of life in the entire Arab world, are the most educated Arab society anywhere on the globe. What are you talking about? This doesn't make sense. But that's the way it was. And the reason that there was this, and people, I would encourage people, I moderated a fascinating panel, the Israel Hayom's conference that we've done online that's going to be broadcast. The second day of it is going to be broadcast today, and you can also watch it on Israel Hayom's Twitter feed and Facebook page, and later it'll be posted on YouTube, where I was moderating a panel with Israelis and a Bahraini writer and an Egyptian intellectual talking about things. And, we were discussing really the eclipse of pan-Arabism and pan-Islamism. These were two ideologies that were central to the understanding of the Middle East for decades and decades and decades. And basically, they were completely destructive because they said that the central both of them made hating Israel and sinking its annihilation the central component of a pan-Arab, pan-Islamic identity for the nations of the region, to their own detriment, to the detriment of the peoples of the region. And suddenly, largely as a result of Obama's foreign policy, which basically embraced it, said, "Oh, okay, we believe you." And so Obama's policy was even more pan-Islamists than theirs was. And then suddenly that caused the destabilization of all of their regimes and the toppling of many of them. And then they suddenly realized, no, we didn't actually mean this. This is terrible. We never expected anybody to take this garbage seriously. And suddenly, they all recognize, wait, we're nations. We're Bahrainis, we're Emiratis, we're Saudis, we're Egyptians. We want to be these things. We don't want to tie our fortunes and make ourselves dependent on the whims of Yasser Arafat or Mahmoud Abbas or Hamas or any of them. We have to worry about ourselves. We have to worry about our own survival. And by the way, Israel is facing the same enemies that we are. So it was a rejection of pan-Islamism and pan-Arabism by the Arabs and the Muslims themselves, many of them, obviously not Turkey, not Iran, not the Muslim Brotherhood, but the ones that we're making peace with, that led them to make peace with us. And it was really because of Donald Trump's willingness to look at things as they are, as opposed to, like everybody else, trying to push things into preconceived notions about the way people are. He was able to identify this and capitalize on it and play really a key role in what's happening now. And again, with Sudan being the latest country who's about to join the peace train and normalize its relations with Israel.
Yeah, unbelievable historic times. So then let's jump to the big tech censorship issue, which is also unbelievable historic time, but unbelievable in a very negative sense. Here, just recently, we had a New York Post article about Hunter Biden computer emails that were discovered. Twitter, Facebook censor the sharing of the video of the article. New York Post Twitter account shut down for 5 days.
I think and I actually looked at it today, and the last Twitter tweet that I saw posted by the New York Post was from October 14th. So I'm not sure that it's back up again. I just checked an hour ago, and I didn't think it was up.
Well, the other one I wanted to mention was also the White House spokeswoman Kayleigh McEnany. Her Twitter account was also shut down, and that is only 2 out of plenty of other instances of censorship. I know Google executives have been caught on tape by Project Veritas saying that they are involved in various ways via search, via ads, in influencing the elections. Very, very scary stuff. What's your insight?
Well, I just wrote my column for Israel Hayom, which will be posted, I guess, tomorrow on our website, in English and obviously in Hebrew in the daily paper, about this, because I think you and I and so many of our colleagues on the right side of the political spectrum and among conservatives in the United States and Israel and really around the world have suffered real repression of our views and financial harm in many cases by these tech giants for years. Luckily, my website isn't a major source of income for me. You get $5 here, $7 there, because I never do anything to promote it. It's just an archive of all my articles. But for absolutely no reason, Google Ads delinked my site. They did similar things to Latma. Our YouTube videos were delinked from our bank account years ago. This is years ago, going back almost a decade, and Facebook has shadow banned me repeatedly, and Twitter often does that as well. And that's just me. And I know that you and many of our colleagues have suffered even worse fates than I have at the hands of these giants. So this censorship is nothing new. But what is new there are 2 things. In Israel, we had a case that I write about this week of a conservative publishing house. It's called Shibboleth Library, which is run by a colleague of mine, Rotem Sela, who actually published the Hebrew version of my book, The Israeli Solution, and he'll be publishing the Hebrew versions of any book that I put out as far as I'm concerned, because he's fantastic. So he just founded this new label for his publishing site called Shibboleth Press, or Shibboleth Press, or Shibboleth Library. And this week the company launched a sales campaign that he invested 100,000 shekels in. That's $35,000, and it was just blocked. Facebook just took it down. They froze his corporate account. so they couldn't sell any books, that nobody could see his ads. And this is the second time they did it. They did the same thing to him when he launched a similar sales campaign in April. And why would they do that? You know, I mean, there's no legitimate reason. He wasn't selling hate. He was selling books, you know, and he was selling books by Israeli conservatives and by American conservatives and others. So this is really just kind of the kind of thing that we're not used to seeing, and it's a step up. And of course, what Twitter and Facebook did about the New York Post, that wasn't simply, you know, shadow banning a person. This is a major American newspaper, and they blocked their entire Twitter feed, you know, and then they went after Twitter users who just sent it out even in private messages, so who were trying to share the story about Hunter Biden's, which is a totally legitimate story, and people have repeatedly shown that, you know, this is a much more credible story than any of the rumors that were completely unsupported about fake claims of ties between the Trump administration, the Trump campaign, and President Trump and his colleagues with the Kremlin. So this is, you know, they were all debunked. None of them were true. But here, this story, which is based on emails that have never been disavowed by anybody in the Biden campaign, that is, they are authentic and they've already been shown to be authentic, that was blocked. So this is a new phenomenon. And, you know, the thing to me, you know, there are two aspects to it. One is the disillusionment, because, you know, Israelis in particular, I mean, the United States, it's the same, although conservative media in the United States is more powerful than it is in Israel still today. Right. And mainly because they have Fox and also now Newsmax and One America and other things like that. And in Israel, we have just a very fledgling Channel 20, and aside from that, it's all left. But Israeli right-wingers have been silenced, have been muzzled, have been repressed. Their positions, our positions, have been repressed. Our activists have been, and politicians have been subjected to selective enforcement of laws to criminalize them for actions that non-right-wing politicians, non-right-wing activists take on a regular basis and are applauded for. So, you know, we've seen this kind of action for years, and starting at the beginning of the century, with the rise of social media, with the rise of the internet and its transformation really into the primary form of information dissemination, you know, we were all sort of like, well, it's true, Army radio, nobody's privatizing it, despite the fact that this is our tax money that is going to finance, through the military of all things, a left-wing propaganda outlet, right? Where the station is simply dominated by radical leftists who hate this country, who hate people who love this country, who misinform listeners on a daily basis, on an hourly basis about the issues of the day. And we can't privatize it and we can't shut it down. Same thing, you know, the state broadcaster was supposed to be closed, and then they made some sort of deal with the then communications minister Gilad Erdan, and instead of being closed, they got massive budgets, right? They got even a bigger broadcast budget for both radio and television than they ever had before, and then they go about, they bring in, you know, a fig leaf conservative here or there, and then they silence them when their ratings get too high. So, you know, all of these things we're used to, but we sort of consoled ourselves thinking, okay, well, at least we have social media, and we can write on Facebook, and we can write on Twitter, and, you know, we can communicate with each other. Our ideas can become public through these things. We don't need the big media anymore. We can just bypass them. And what the very aggressive and shameless censorship, you know, they don't care. Like, they just don't care anymore. The fact that they could do this to such a huge story in the middle of a presidential election, you know, campaign, is just saying, we don't care. We don't care what you think. We're so powerful. We don't believe anything will ever be done to us because we control all information. And even trying to launch a campaign against us will destroy you, because we can destroy you, because we have that control, because 97% of web traffic in the United States goes through, or search engine operations in the United States is Google. 3% is non-Google. That's insane. You know, that's not even, I don't even, like, there aren't words for that kind of power. And it's the same concept with Facebook, same concept with Twitter, same concept with YouTube. They're all the same, and they're all owned by the same people. And if
So
somebody, so in Israel, what happened, and this is what I write about, is that on Wednesday, following what happened with the Shibboleth Press, so two Likud MKs, Amina Levy and Ariel Kellner, posted threats to Facebook on their Twitter account saying that if the library isn't reinstated, their account isn't reinstated within X amount of time. That's what Kellner said, that they were going to start legislative proceedings against Facebook. And Amina Levy yesterday just followed through, and he submitted a bill to the Knesset that would require a distinction between social media platforms that involve themselves in the content on their platforms and those that leave people be. And obviously, if there's a court order to block the publication of something, or if there's or if it's illegal, I mean, like the dissemination of pornography, pedophilia, or whatever, obviously that's not included in the Non-Interference Act. But aside from things that you have a court order for, or there are clear legal constraints on its publication, you're not allowed to interfere. So those that interfere with the content on their site will be subjected to a different legal status than those that don't. Those who interfere with content, like all of them today,
Right.
you're going to be liable for lawsuits. You can sue them for content that is on their site or is that barred from their site. You can sue them, so that Shibboleth Library or the New York Post in this case would be able to sue Twitter and Facebook. And moreover, it would subject them to transparency rules under law that would require them to actually set out the guidelines for their interference in content. Because one of the things that they found at Shibboleth Press, the first time that this happened, is they appealed the ruling to freeze their account in the middle of their sales campaign 7 times. They never even understood why it was happening, except the obvious explanation, which is that this is censorship. And that, of course, is probably, in fact, that is very clearly the reason why it happened.
Right.
But the 7th appeal finally received a final verdict, which is that not only would their account not be unblocked, that it was going to be permanently blocked. All right. And there was no explanation. You didn't have to, the Facebook, the anonymous employees at Facebook that are accountable to nobody, that nobody knows, they didn't have to publish any guidelines. Well, we're not going to publish conservative press. We're not going to publish anything related to conservative books. They don't have to acknowledge what it is that they're doing. They can pretend that they're not doing what they're doing. So Halevi's bill would say, no, you can't. If you want to interfere with content, you have to set out forthrightly what content you're going to interfere with and under what circumstances. And he also wants to require them to have to publish an annual report of all of the content, detailing every single content that they've interfered with, that they blocked, and justify their actions. So that this would subject them to the kind of transparency requirements that you would expect. Because look, they're not making any bones about it anymore. They're publishers. They're not neutral platforms. They are deciding who can and cannot be published on Facebook, who can and cannot, and what can and cannot be published on Facebook. And it's not hate speech, which itself is a nebulous term that was invented and manipulated in order to advance the political fortunes of this group or against another group. So it's not about hate speech. It's not about anything. You can't say that publishing, Free to Choose by Milton Friedman is an act of aggression against somebody. You know what I mean? It's not a hate crime. Right. So that's what he suggests. And I think, I hope that this will get passed. But, I think it's very clear. All of this time, I was personally being victimized by Facebook and all of these. And I said, well, it's not my primary means of income. It's not even a marginal one. And beyond that, it's not my sandbox. What can I do? I didn't invent this. I'm not a shareholder in this. This is Zuckerberg's thing. If he and his communist friends want to screw around with me and my colleagues, what can we do about it? We're using their platform. They get to do what they want. But the problem is that they are blocking all competition. They gobble up any platform that has the ability to in any way threaten their control over the dissemination of information. YouTube, purchased by Google and subjected to draconian censorship. I mean, just look at Prager University, and others. That's a prominent example. And Facebook bought Instagram. I mean, they prevent actual competition. They actively go out and swallow up every platform that is capable of threatening their monopoly. So if they're going to be a monopoly, then they have to be regulated. Or not regulated. There have to be limitations and very clear legal stipulations on what they may or may not do. I wouldn't give this over to the regulators, because regulators will just be co-opted anyway. They suck. But I mean, but you have to do these things. You also, if you want anybody to have a fighting chance to actually get into this, like Parler and others that are trying to get into this, the only way that you can is by forcing them to adhere to rules of transparency that are going to be, enabling people like you and me, and our newspapers and, our colleagues to actually get their opinions out, because that was what the point of this was supposed to be. If they're able to continue on with this kind of censorship, and they will, and I think that they're likely to try to continue regardless of who wins on November 3rd. I think that they'll become more aggressive regardless of whether it's a Joe Biden presidency, God forbid, or a Donald Trump presidency, God willing. They're going to lash out if Trump wins, and they're going to feel empowered if Biden wins. They have to be constrained. They have to be constrained through legislation. I know that President Trump has pledged to, change the law and make them liable for litigation in the United States. And I think that these things are essential.
So you mentioned that it's happened to me personally, and to my personal accounts, to my business accounts. Huge impact on our business a number of years ago. And I'll tell you a little secret. Back in 2011, when we established a new line of our business, I knew this was going to happen, so much so that I established our business strategy to take this into consideration. And I called it riding the wave. It was 2011. I said, listen, folks, we're going to ride the wave. We're going to grow as much as possible using Facebook. At the time was the biggest player. But it's going to end. And it's going to end, and we'll be as big as we can, and then we'll grow from there. But I knew that was going to happen. It's just the way of the world. If you understand the right and the left, the second the left sees that the right's getting power and has a voice, well, they shut us down. It's a historical fact, unfortunately. But you want to know what's really scary? It's not just the censorship that's scary. It's hearing how many regular Joe Schmoes, regular mom and pops, are supporting the censorship, supporting the New York Post article being taken down and being forbidden to be shared and forbidden to be seen on social networks because it's fake news. And of course, fake news shouldn't be out there. It's like, yes, of course, Facebook and Twitter would have the opportunity, big brother and big mother have the opportunity to decide for us what's right, what's wrong, what we should say. That's the scary thing that so many people speech.
Right. Well, what it shows is how effective the censorship is, because I mean, what they're telling their users, their unsuspecting users, whose sentiments may very well be on the left, but that doesn't mean that they support censorship per se. It means that they're being manipulated, and they are being manipulated because it's not a normal thing for a citizen of a democracy to come down on the side of censorship. And the reason why you do is because for 4 years, the people who have been most engaged, most involved in disseminating fake news are saying that everything that comes out on the other side, which is more likely than not to be true, is fake news, right? I mean, the fact that Adam Schiff can say with a straight face, right, that Hunter Biden's the contents of his the publication of the contents of his emails is a Russian disinformation campaign, shows how demented things have become, right? Because for 4 years he's been peddling this lie about Russia interfering on behalf of Trump, when now we know for certain, 100% certainty, that the people who were engaged with the Kremlin in disseminating disinformation in the 2016 campaign were the Hillary Clinton campaign, the DNC, and over the years, the FBI and the CIA. Right. So these were the actual organizations that were involved, and in Hillary Clinton's case, paying for the dissemination of false information generated by agents of the Kremlin, right, into the U.S. media. And for 4 years, they have been projecting precisely what they did onto their victims. And that, to me, is astounding, right? And so, but this is what people have. And you talk to the average, average left-leaning American, who may, traditionally be a Democrat or what have you, and they believe it. They still believe it, right? And that's what's happening now all over the United States. So these people have been lied to for 4 years, and it's gotten to the point. And this is, by the way, why it's so important to limit the powers of these social media giants by requiring them to abide by transparency, by enabling their victims to sue them, because what they're doing is a threat to open societies, because what they're saying to people is you don't have freedom of thought. We're going to tell you what to think. And by the way, what we're going to tell you is a lie. All right. And anybody who deviates from our view is going to be censored. And they're doing it. So, I mean, this is a very clear and present danger because, as I said in my article, there are many foundations for free societies, but two very key ones are freedom of expression and the free flow of information. And what we've been subjected to on the right in Israel for decades, and I dare say since the outset of the state, only it's gotten much worse as with the passage of time and the rise of the right as a political force in Israel, as a dominant political force in Israel, is an attempt to distort the marketplace of ideas in this country by putting a thumb on the scales in favor of the left against the right, blocking the speech of right-wing Israelis in major media outlets, and by going after media outlets that are right-wing. Like, for instance, the 2012 attempt by 43 members of the Knesset to outlaw the paper that I work for, to ban Israel Hayom, the largest circulation daily in Israel, because they don't like its political position, and its editorial line that supports Netanyahu. And now, last year, the Attorney General's decision to expand, illegally, but whatever, expand the definition of bribery to include the proffering of positive coverage to right-wing politicians. So they've criminalized the practice of journalism insofar as that journalism is practiced in a manner that supports non-leftist politicians. These sorts of things are happening every day in Israel, and they're happening to greater and lesser degrees in the United States and in other Western democracies. And these things are threats. They harm people's ability to make educated decisions. I mean, how can you vote, right, if key information about the candidates is blocked, and you're told lies, right? Like the idea that these emails are fake. They're not fake. It's clear. I mean, you're being subjected to disinformation. How do you deal with that?
So let me ask this, and we'll finish up with this. I mean, I know you mentioned this before. President Trump, the Department of Justice now, Attorney General Barr, is actually working on an antitrust suit to be brought against Google. Now, I imagine if President Trump loses the elections and President Biden wins, that's going to be buried. And then, are you afraid that these winds of growing censorship will only continue to grow with the left back in power in the White House and in D.C.?
Look, yes, because given the left's historic efforts in Israel, the United States, and elsewhere to censor non-leftist opinion and non-leftist information, you can assume that this is going to go on. I think it was Victor Davis Hanson who said recently, if it wasn't him, then it was somebody else, that we have to remember that democracies are not the norm in human history. Non-democracies are. And, I mean, we are moving towards a post-democratic order. And by democratic, I know Mike Lee wrote a piece saying America is a constitutional republic, not a democracy. Okay, so leave aside, how people vote and how a majority is determined, whether by an electoral college or by a majority or proportional representation or what have you. The point is that free societies are often viewed wrongly as synonymous with democracies, but they are increasingly being besieged by left-wing totalitarians who want to suppress views, ideas, people who see the world in a way that they don't see it, see the world in the way that people have always viewed their societies, whether it's the United States or Israel or any other country, or Britain. I read this article, somebody sent it today, that was published in The Nation, where they were saying that you need a truth commission against the Trump administration if Biden is elected president. I mean, they want to start using totalitarian means to punish deviants who don't see the world that the way that they see it, and these aren't mere words. I mean, these are very, very dangerous sentiments, very anti-democratic statements, anti-freedom statements. They're intolerant, and they're shared by a lot of people who have a lot of power. And so, we have to bear in mind, right, that our state of life, our way of life in freedom, in open societies, is very much at stake, both with the U.S. presidential elections and with Israel's problems with our dictatorial left-wingers in our deep state, in our legal fraternity, and so on and so forth. And one of the key nodes of these bids for control is social media platforms. So I think, this is a really important fight, and we just have to hope for the best, because if we don't fight this, if we don't win it, then our situation is not going to be improved in time. It's going to deteriorate.
Hold on. I think Carolyn froze. She was talking, if we don't fight this.
You froze.
Stick with us, folks. We lost you. Carolyn, you back?
I don't know. You're frozen.
I was frozen? So you were just getting back. You were saying if we don't fight this.
If we don't fight this and we don't win it, our situation is going to be far worse than it in the future than it is today. This is a direct threat to our way of life.
All right. On a positive note, you're off to watch the Israel Hayom conference. Any headlines you want to give us for that, or what's the importance of this online conference you're involved in right now? We'll end with that.
Look, I think people should really watch it, whether live right now and we get offline or in recorded form, because what you see here is what peace is supposed to look like. That it's not Arabs, the Jordanians and the Egyptians that we've experienced in the past, and of course the Palestinians, who refuse to normalize their relations with us. And aside from formal relations between governments, there's nothing. And Israel's flag continues to be burned in the streets, and terrorism continues to be supported by the media. These are serious efforts, and these are serious moves forward towards peace. These people are, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, are excited to be at peace with Israel. They're enthusiastic about it. The majority of the population in both countries support the peace deals with Israel enthusiastically. And people were trying to make light of the fact that these are called normalization agreements and not specifically peace agreements, but that misses the whole point, because the reason why the peace agreements that we signed with the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the deals that we signed with the Palestinians didn't really lead to real peace is because they rejected normalization of ties. I mean, the idea is that if you're at peace, then live at peace, have economic ties, have tourism ties, have friendly ties, have friendly contact with one another, view one another as neighbors and colleagues and friends. And you see this very clearly in the incredible warmth of the reception that Israelis and the peace itself with us is being is being greeted with by in the UAE and Bahrain. And I have to say, I'm very cynical about this whole thing because I'm used to the fake pieces that we've been making over the years. So this is really a different situation altogether.
Yeah,
and
and
I think it's very clear.
on that point, Dr. Kedar has said the fact that it's called a normalization agreement actually shows how much better and stronger it is than the peace agreement that did not include normalization.
Right. Actually, both of the peace treaties included normalization chapters, but the Arabs from the outset and in material breach of the agreements themselves refused to implement them. So, I mean, this was something that was a deliberate position by both the Egyptians and the Jordanians, and in Jordan, particularly to this day, the peace is just a cold and nasty peace. Where the Jordanians make all the benefit and Israel gives everything. And here, you see the situation very much very different. That's much better, and it makes a lot more sense.
Right. It brings up a great topic. We'll bring it up another time, not now because we have to end, but I'd love to continue this and then hear your insight into whether you think these normalization agreements with UAE, Bahrain, and now Sudan could make an impact on a development of true normalization with Egypt and Jordan or not. But not for now, another time. Good point. Carolyn, always a pleasure speaking to you. Stay safe, stay healthy, enjoy homeschooling, enjoy the Australia conference.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. And everyone, thanks for watching another episode of the Carolyn Glick Show with Avi Ubalo. Hello, everyone. Take care.